A disaster just struck. You had a plan, right? So let's talk about emergency management and basically having a plan for every emergency that might occur. Now, I want to start off by differentiating between an emergency plan and a business continuity plan. They're two different things. An emergency plan is something that you're going to put together based on an event or a disaster that might occur that reflects or impacts your building as a whole. So power failure, flood, tornado, things like that. Business continuity is related but different. Business continuity is when those things happen and you're dealing with them, how do you ensure that your organization can continue to operate? A slight extension of that is you have to have business continuity for your service providers, for your technology, for help desk, because if they go down, you're not able to deliver service. So business continuity is both for your organization and for yourself, but it is different from emergency planning. So how do you figure out what to do in emergency planning on? Well, you really need to start by figuring out what the risks are. And the risks will be different depending on where you live or where your buildings are, the kind of function or activities within those buildings, because they will represent different kinds of risks from a business perspective. Many of the risks, however, are going to be the same no matter where you are. They're fundamental to operating and maintaining a building. Fires, floods, weather events, hazardous spills, and things like that. I'm not going to go over every one of the kinds of risks you have to deal with. I'm going to have a list up here for you. Now, the question simply is, once you've listed those things out, what do you do with them? Well, use the classic risk matrix, risk management approach, which is, what's the likelihood of it happening? And if it happens, what's the impact? Every one of those risks, you can go through and you can do that analysis. So impact 1 to 5, likelihood or probability 1 to 5. For every one of the risks, you figure out what that number is, you can multiply them together, and the higher the number, the bigger the risk. Like I talk about in capital planning and risks related to equipment failing and being in bad condition, you can't just use that number. It's a starting point only because there might be some things that are actually scoring lower when you take that approach that are actually more critical to deal with. So don't just use a numerical, don't just use a matrix, which I'm going to show just to my side here, but you also need to think about your unique specific requirements, go through that list, and really figure it out from your own perspective. So once you have that list, and you've ranked them, then you can start to think about what are you going to do with them. And again, this is classic risk management. Are you going to avoid that risk? Which means you do something that means that that risk can't happen. Not always easy in a building. You can't move your building, for instance, right? Are you going to mitigate? So mitigate is, if the risk happens, what have you done to reduce its probability perhaps, or reduce its impact? So mitigation is as simple as having backups. So you have a diesel generator as a backup, that is mitigating the risk of a power failure. The degree to which you're mitigating depends on the actual backup power, full operations, or only critical things. The next one is transfer. Now, this is part of the classic process, however, you really can't transfer the kind of risks we deal with. You can transfer financial risk, but you can't transfer the risk of a power failure, the risk of a hazardous spill onto a contractor, for instance, because it doesn't matter whether they caused the problem or were unable to resolve it. In other words, they didn't have a plan. You are still the one who's responsible. So transfer risk is rarely something you can do. So the last one is accept it. It's going to happen. What's your plan? Now, you still might want a plan for the ones you avoid or mitigate, just in case they happen. But the ones that you accept, that you know they're going to happen, you can't avoid, you can't mitigate, you can't transfer, those are the ones you really want to focus on having a good plan for. So when they happen, you can deal with them. So then after you've done all that, now's the time to actually develop your plans. Now, first thing that's most important is keep them short, keep them concise, because if they're too long and too complicated, you're not going to use them anyway. So during the planning process, there's a few really key things you want to take into account. Number one, stakeholders. Who else is involved? Obviously, other people within your organization, whether it's operations or HR, or maybe there's even an emergency management group for your company. Those are the people you want to deal with. Also dealing with other authorities like fire, police, etc., depending on what kind of disaster emergency you have to deal with. But it's really important that you don't develop a plan in isolation. So the next thing is resources. Who are you going to need involved to deal with this emergency? That's contractors, suppliers, so for equipment and materials, things like that, your own staff, or anybody else who needs to be involved. Resourcing is really important because with some kinds of emergencies, those resources might be very hard to find, especially if it's a citywide or a statewide or province-wide kind of emergency. Tornadoes, floods, things like that have a broad impact. Getting those things might be harder to do, so you want to put some planning in place for that. Maybe even store some materials. So communications and decision-making is also really important. Who do you have to communicate with if there's an emergency? Do you need to advise HR so HR can let everybody know that they shouldn't come into the building because there's been a spill or a flood? That's a simple example of communications. There's going to be others within your organization who need to be talked to if there is an emergency. So possibly HR, finance, operations folks, senior management who really want to know what's going on just in case the media calls, for instance. And along the line is decision making. So who's going to make decisions about spending, about shutting the building down, about putting in alternate arrangements so that you can continue to operate, and how that's going to work? You want to make sure that the decision-making chain is well understood, but also simple enough that you can actually deal with an emergency without having to wait for decisions. And I mentioned business continuity at the beginning, that emergency planning is different from business continuity. Well, guess what? You've got to build that business continuity into your emergency management. You tack it on at the bottom so that when you're dealing with an emergency and you're making people safe, you're maintaining the asset and keeping it safe, and you're dealing with whatever else comes up in that emergency, the rest of your organization and even some of your own service delivery will be able to continue in one way or another. So now that you've got your plan, what's important? Well, you've got to communicate it to the people who are involved. You have to provide training of some sort. And if possible, you need to do testing. So testing could be tabletop, where you get everybody involved and you go over a scenario to make sure everybody understands their role and what should happen. The other way you do testing is sort of live testing. We're very familiar with this in emergency evacuation, which is a very common test that we have to do. Other emergencies, you could also use a live style training. Okay, so now you've got your plan. All you have to do is wait for the disaster, and then you can implement it. And guess what you do after you implement it? Well, you recover. So part of your plan should include a recovery phase. The recovery phase is, now that you've stabilized things, you've kept things safe, you've got a diesel up and running, you've figured out where you're going to get your diesel fuel for to keep you going until the main power comes back. When all of that gets resolved, how do you get back to normal? That's what your plan should also include. And finally, because everything's a cycle, if you've had a disaster, an emergency that you've had to deal with, you need to sit down and look at lessons learned. What went right? What went wrong? What should change in your plan? And even if you haven't had an emergency that you've had to activate your plan for this year, you really should sit down and look at them, relook at the priorities, relook at your plan, make sure it's up to date. The approach, the communications, the considerations that you've had to build into that plan, are they still up to date? Are they still going to work? And then make any changes you need to. Finally, you're ultimately, as a facility manager, responsible for the safety and the continued operations of your building. So you really need to have emergency plans in place to make sure you can do that.